Good day, everyone. I would say afternoon, which it is here in Indiana, but it isn't necessarily where you are. I know that in the world in which we live. So I'm so glad that you're here, whatever time of day or night it is, for another Live with Kevin. If you're following along, you might have known that I did this 3 hours ago for our podcast. But I'm doing it now, not for our podcast. Up over the corner of my friend there, you see celebrating 30 years, which is what this series is a chance for us, having been in business now for this at the start of 30 years, to give back a little bit, perhaps, to the world around us. Here's the story. So over the last, I don't know, dozen years, I have led conversations with experts and smart people like my guest here, as the host of a podcast or other sorts of things, well over 600 times now. And I've been a guest on other people's podcasts many, many times as well. But it's in this series, it's the first time where we've actually had someone basically interviewing me or leading the conversation with me on our channel. So the basic gist of this is that to celebrate 30 years, I picked some people that I wanted to join me to have a conversation about important topics that we felt like we've learned something about over the last 30 years. And so that's what these are about. So if you're here with us live, I hope that you will engage in this conversation. I called it an interview a second ago, and in a way it is. I'm going to hand the mic around, turn the mic around, if you will, to Byron here in a minute. I'll introduce him in a second, but it's really a conversation. So if you're here live, I hope that if you have a question, you'll ask it. If you have a comment, you'll share it, just like you would if we were sitting around the table or in a classroom or whatever. So that's what I hope that you will do. And if you're watching later rather than live, I'm still glad that you're here. I think you'll get great value out of this and hope that you'll stay. And if you really have a question that you wanted maybe me to answer, just go to LinkedIn and send me a note, and I'll be happy to answer it. Put it in the comments here, but sending me a note in LinkedIn might be better. So what today? Today we're going to talk about being a lifelong learner. And here's what I know. I know that if you've chosen to be here, I'm probably preaching to the choir. But I also know that while all of us would probably, even people who might not choose to be here, would say, oh, being a lifelong learner is a good idea. I don't need to sell you on the idea, but I think that many of us struggle with, okay, but how do I do it? What does it really look like? It's one thing to hear it at our high school commencement or our college graduation. It's another thing to do it in the course of a day with a calendar that looks like mine, with responsibilities of all sorts and that sort of thing. And that's really what we're going to talk about today: how to do it, not why to do it, but how to do it. And so that's why we're here. That's our topic. You see this gentleman with me. He is my friend. He is my colleague. We went to college together, but did not know that until far later. One of the regrets of my life is not knowing this man sooner. But this man is Byron Ernest. He was, if you think about education in the United States, he's sort of done it all. He was the 2010 Indiana Teacher of the Year. He's been on the State Board of Education. He's been on the National Board of Education, or no, on the National Association of School Boards of Educators. He has been a principal, a superintendent. He's been in advisory roles of all sorts, and now he runs a company called Leadery Global, where he works with education leaders and teachers and administrators around the world. And I can think of no one better to have join me to talk about lifelong learning than Byron Ernest. So Byron, now you can correct anything I said wrong in the intro, and I'm turning the mic over to you, sir.
You did not say anything wrong. We're all good. How's that for the only thing that I would say, just to get us started, the term lifelong learning has always intrigued me, because it's kind of like as to whether we're lifelong learners or not, right? We learn every day different things. It's what we do with that, right? And so I think that's one thing that I always think about. And so, Kevin, I got to start with, because you and I have for whatever reason, and I'm going to say it's my fault for not being the greatest of friends at time, but you and I, when we would get together, we used to get together on a pretty regular basis. You'd have tea and I'd have coffee, and the topic was always, what's the newest cool thing that we've learned? So my first question for you is, what's the newest, and the
Okay.
crowd can tell this has not been pre-planned. So my
Well,
goal is to have him stumped a little bit as we go along.
so here's the thing, everybody. I forgot to say this in the open. We when we were together before we went live, we were having a little internet trouble, and apparently we had it. So I didn't get the whole question, but I think the question was, what is the latest thing I've learned? Is that the gist of it?
Correct.
So everybody, if we have a gap, we apologize. You all know we've experienced that before, and we're not going to not have this conversation happen because of that. So, I suppose the easy answer would be things related to AI, and I suppose that's certainly a fair answer, but it seems like kind of a boring answer because a lot of people might be saying that. Although I've spent a lot of time this year thinking about that in terms of how it impacts our business, how we can use it in terms of service delivery. We've used it for lots of things. It'll probably get used when this is over, Byron, to create some short. AI will be used to create some short video clips that we can pull from this. So there's that. So I guess I'll start there. You probably want a different answer than that, but that's probably. Well, I'll give you another one. So like on a topic area, that's a fair answer. But I had an experience, let's see, about 10 days ago now. Well, I guess like 9 days ago, that I did something for only the second time in my life. And I learned something from that as well. So several years ago, I was asked by my niece, Allie, to be the officiant at her wedding in Louisville, Kentucky, which I did. And this summer, I was asked by my niece, Allie, on the other side of the family, to be the officiant for her and her now husband, Kevin, for their wedding, which I did 9 days ago. And I learned a lot in the process of doing that. So the first one, Byron, there was very few degrees of freedom. Like, here's what we need you to do, Kevin. We basically need you to read the script, pretty much. The second one, here are the vows, here are the scripture readings. The rest of it is entirely up to you. So I had a lot more degrees of freedom in the second one than I had in the first one. And one of the things that I learned from that was that I was reminded of how important preparation is, because you know this about me, that I can be pretty emotional. And I was really worried that I'd get the beginning of this thing and I wouldn't be able to make it through. Like, I was worried. And I'm pretty confident, Byron, there were bets placed about that. And I can't say that I didn't have a little issue occasionally, but for the most part, I made it through pretty well. And the thing that I learned or relearned or was reminded of is that when you really, truly prepare, and I probably prepared per minute of presentation time more for this than for anything I've ever done, because I wanted to overcome that one piece. And that's what I learned. So there you go.
Wow, there's a lot there, Kevin.
You had no idea what I was going to say. There you go.
No, to unpack. And I think first, it's interesting. I want to go back to the AI piece, and then I want to come back to this because you've got a lot here that I think we need to unpack. And I was related to AI. I was just out in San Diego with Hattie Parkrovi, who is the CEO of Code.org, who they work in AI, and they are the major player in AI in education right now. And one of the things that he said to me was, new stuff is mind-blowing. Old stuff is indispensable, right? And I think about the times when you and I have had conversations about new things that we've had, and then those new things really seem wild at the time, then they become indispensable. And then some things like our flip videos are no longer even, they're in a museum, right? Or you still have them on your back shelf because you pulled them out the last time we were doing one of these, and I
Yeah, it
mentioned
was
them,
right
right?
over here. One of
Yeah,
them anyway. But yeah, so, there's and I think that's really important. And here's why, because there's a lot of worry and concern about what AI is going to do. And I could take you back through all sorts of other technology changes where many of the same worries occurred. And they're not even all technologies, right? Rock and roll, there's an example, right? But I'll go back to the 1830s. And if you go back and read what people were saying, what people were worried about the railroad and people riding trains, it's going to make people insane. It's going to jostle up their, like, all this stuff was, really concerns, like sometimes with research associated with it and all of this stuff. And so I think that one of the things to remember is that when something's new and it's kind of wowing us and all that stuff, are there concerns? Yes. Should we be aware of the concerns? Yes. Are they almost always overblown? Yes. And I think people are probably out there listening saying right now, but Kevin, this one's different, and maybe a little, but I don't know it's that much different. And so one of the things about being a lifelong learner is being able to see trends and being able to see maybe patterns. Now, I recently wrote 2 articles back-to-back weeks, Byron, about pattern recognition. And there's tremendous value in pattern recognition. I've just sort of extolled the virtues of it right now. There are downsides to it as well. But I think that when we stop and realize that pattern recognition is helpful to us and we look for patterns, there's a chance to help us learn something.
absolutely. And so the other thing that I want to touch on, and I think this goes to learning and leadership, and I want you made the comment degrees of freedom, that you'd been given some degrees of freedom. And so this week, and I had an experience, and I want you to touch on back on this degrees of freedom, freedom and how it relates to learning, as well as drawing in from my quick experience that I want to share. So I had a few people who were out in San Diego with me, and I said something about, I'm like, man, it'd be great to get out on the water. We're right here on the bay. Well, long story short, I rented an 18-foot Hurricane boat with a 180 horse motor on it and had people out on a boat, right? But they had me watch this 5-minute video and gave me so much of what not to do. And if I did the things that I was not to do and did them wrong, that I was almost scared for the first part of the boat trip because I was afraid I'd do something wrong. And we actually talked about that on the boat, of how terrible of a leadership trait that is, right? To put your people in a position of being afraid of making mistakes. And so I want you to talk about this degree of freedom and also this ability as we learn to be able to make mistakes.
Well, from a leadership perspective, well, first of all, how people frame mistakes has a huge impact on how effectively they'll learn, right? Because if I frame mistakes as, oh no, spaghetti-o, then I'm going to want to avoid them and I won't make them. And so if I don't try stuff, I won't make mistakes. So that makes safe. But then if I'm not trying, I'm minimizing my chances to learn. So that's the individual side of that. So as a leader, we've got to be careful that we make it that we're not inadvertently creating that environment, right? Like, Byron, here's what I've observed my entire life. Everyone says we learn from our mistakes. And yet most of us say, well, I got to be careful about making mistakes. So there's 2 sides to that, and you got to be careful about the other side. Now, as a leader, a lot of times we get promoted because we were really good at stuff. And so we get promoted to lead the people doing that same stuff. And so we've got some confidence about doing those things. And we might even have some ego attached to doing those things a certain way, the way we did them or whatever. And so that can get in the way of all of this. So I would say that if we really want to help others learn, and we've got to help them reframe what mistakes are. Now, to me, there are good mistakes and bad mistakes. The same mistake made 7 times without learning anything from it is no longer a good mistake, right? A mistake made that puts someone's life in jeopardy, which may be in part some of the ones related to the boat. We got to be, there's a line here, but conceptually, if it's a mistake that we learn something from, so we don't repeat, if it's a mistake that didn't really cause anything super negative to happen, if it's a level 1 mistake where you can just go back and do it again with no big issues, right? I think it's Amazon that talks about level 2 mistakes. If you go through the door and once you go through the door, you can never go back. Well, that's a different kind of decision than the ones that, okay, we'll just go try door number 2 and door number 3 and door number 4. So I think that I'm kind of going all around here, but to answer your question, I think we have to frame mistakes carefully in our own mind. And then as leaders, we got to be careful that we're not sharing a bias that's not the one we want, or that we recognize that other people's bias might be the problem that we need to help them overcome.
Beautiful. And by the way, the SpaghettiOs, which was your terminology there,
100%.
was when they told me that if I got into a wrong area, it was going to be $500 in this area or $1,000 to get me back. Right? There were no lives involved. It was my pocketbook that I was.
Well, but that's okay. But let's go back to the specific of your story, though, which is also, I think, really important as a leader. A lot of times we communicate stuff and say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Now, in the case of that, there are probably a couple of those don'ts that we need to be aware of and clear about. But we're far better off to talk about what to do rather than what not to do. So, like, let's say there's this area that's, a quarter of a mile out there. You see that area, quarter of a mile out there? Make sure when you get close to that, steer to the right or the left. Don't go to that area. Steer to the right or left. As long as you stay to the right or left, you'll be golden. Like, talk about what you want as opposed to what you don't want, both in terms of helping someone else learn something, but also in terms of our own learning for ourselves. Like, because when we say, well, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, then we're locking ourselves in and we're setting ourselves up to be scared. We're setting ourselves up to feel guilty if we mess it up and all those sorts of things.
So you've segued perfectly into another item that I really want to talk about here, have you talk about from what you've learned. And you brought it up at the beginning. Hey, sometimes it's hard to be a lifelong learner because I'm super busy. I got to find time to learn and what have you. What have you learned in 30 years about coaching others from a lifelong learning standpoint?
Well, I think that part of it is to coach from as my friend Michael Bungay-Stanier would say, who was actually on my podcast earlier today. So if you're watching this, you go back and see he and I's conversation. We didn't really talk about this, but to coach from a place of curiosity rather than a place of advice, right? So if someone comes to me for advice, they may learn something from that. And certainly that's part of what I do for a living. It's kind of what we're doing here. Mm-hmm. And yet when we can coach from a place of asking questions and getting people to reflect for themselves and getting people to think it through for themselves, the learning is much richer, because the most powerful learning on the planet is discovery learning. When we get it for ourselves, like, that's way better than anything that we get from somebody else, right? So, like, even if you or I are reading a book and the words on the page might be excellent, it's that moment when we make the connection between what they wrote and something that we know or what now we're clear on. That's the powerful learning. So as a coach, the key is for us to help people discover. And if we can help people discover they're going to learn, have more lasting learning, number one. And number two is we're going to help reinvigorate that yearning. I mean, listen, to be a lifelong learner is to be at our best as a human. And people forget that. And if we can help them start to see that and open their eyes and their hearts to that, then we can help them make new choices for themselves.
So that overlaps a little bit. I want to bring in, I want to make sure he knows that I saw it here in the comments. Keith Wills made a comment in the chat that continuing to learn was a big concern of his when he retired. And so you and I, we aren't retiring. Me, probably no time soon, because I love what I'm doing, and I've heard you say that too. But we are in our sixth decade or close to. Well, I just turned into my sixth decade, right?
I'm a year ahead of you.
So yeah, so we're at that point. How do you, just to continue off of this coaching, how do you, Kevin, keep that learning? And I know that's a hard question because you're a lot like me. We just have that, right? But I think we've somewhat developed that. And what do you tell that person like Keith? And it looks like in Keith's comment it was a big concern. So I think maybe he's got it figured out, and it'd be great to hear that.
I mean, I know that Keith retired recently, so I know he's working on it. So that
okay,
so I think the answer is all about why and all about purpose, right? And so, here's the thing. There are lots of people who say, well, I'm not really a lifelong learner. But if you ask them about their hobby, they can tell you the 43 things they've done in the last 12 days to learn more about that hobby or to get better at that thing or whatever it is. And so I think that sometimes people don't define themselves as such when they are. I think that's part of it. And I think that we can sometimes help people see that. But if people, or if we feel a little stuck, feel a little sluggish, one of the ways to get out of that is to go find something to learn, to connect to something that's meaningful to you, and even if it's not meaningful to anyone else, and then go start learning about it, right? And the beautiful thing is that, you mentioned our age. So if you go back 40 years when you bought that house, when the kitchen looked the way it did before you started this remodel, the options or the ways, the media that we had to learn from were not nearly as many as it is now. It's unbelievable. Like, let's just take this conversation that we're having, that literally anyone with an internet connection right now could be watching this live right now. Like, that wasn't possible 30 years ago, 40 years ago, no internet. But you know what I'm saying? I mean, not for the general public. And so, like, the choices and the options that we have are unbelievable, right? But I think it all starts with purpose or why. And if that's there, I think humans will begin to be better human. Now, but this takes me back to something that I got to say in this conversation, and especially with you, who's, as I said, has been in education your whole career. The other big thing that gets in a lot of people's way here is, to them, learning equals school. And we got to get people that have the most trouble with this idea of being a lifelong learner graduated from school, or didn't like school, or school wasn't fun for them, or school was socially awkward for them, or whatever. And so if learning equals school, then a lot of what we've said doesn't make sense. But if learning equals life, then it's a totally different thing.
Absolutely. Okay. So here's this is so perfect because you prompted another question here. When was the last time that Kevin Eikenberry was in a learning slump, and what did you pick to learn about?
Well, I think I go in slump-ettes semi-regularly. And the way I get out of most, well, so there's a couple things. One is the nature of my work makes it hard for me to stay in them very long. Because if you're going to do a podcast every week, and which means you're going to read somebody's book, which means, and in fact, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to read the book, right? This is the one I did today. Like, I'm not going to have this conversation with Michael and read the book. And so that's the choice that I make. So even if I go into it saying I got to read it because I got to read it because I got to read it, like, it kind of gets me out of it. But I, if I'm in a slump to me, the solution is to go into my library or into my stack of unread books and just randomly pick one up. And if that doesn't sort of get me going, then just no judgment, just pick up something else. And if it isn't a book, it's just, let the internet move me towards something that I find fascinating or that gets me curious, and then just sort of go down that rabbit hole for a few minutes or a long time, depending, right? That'd be my answer.
Okay. I love the term slump-ettes. I'm going to guess that would have the little red dashes under it in the Word document. And
oh, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And I use lots of words that have that, right?
I do too, right? I make up words that I can't even spell myself. So therefore, that makes it fun, right? So Kevin, one of the things that has always impressed me, drawn me to you, wanted me to watch you, is that you have this incredible ability to stay just ahead of or be right there when the next thing's there and you're learning about it. How do you do that?
Well, first of all, thank you. And I was, as you were saying that, I was thinking, man, I don't know that that's true. And then I was thinking that, well, that's like the third time I've heard that in a week. So I guess it must be true. So there's the first lesson, everybody. If someone gives you feedback, say thank you. And if you hear it several times, then it's probably some truth to it. So I think that it's a couple of things. One is, if you think about it, if we're sort of talking about this from a business perspective, right? And so our business mission or purpose is one that will never be reached because it's about more, right? Helping more leaders make a bigger positive difference. And so if that's where we're trying to go, then that sets the table for, I got to be figuring out what's next so we can have a bigger, different, outsized impact. So part of it is sort of baked into our business. But I think part of it is that I'm generally a pretty curious person. And so I think there's part of it that goes with that. So like once, again, to take us back to anybody, if you've got purpose, then it makes it easy to apply curiosity toward that and asking yourself questions related to how do we move closer to that? What's working? What's not working? What can we do that would make a difference, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. Awesome. So you've now had 30 years of learning in this, right?
Well, I had 60 years of learning, but I got 30 doing this. Yeah.
Okay. I'm celebrating. I'm celebrating.
Yep.
Because that's in my corner up there, that 30 years. I'm going to use the 30 years. Okay. So let's go back to year one that you were in business. Right?
Okay.
Give me the top couple of things, and I've got a couple of questions here I'm going to ask with this. Give me the top couple of things, whatever kind of list you want to give, of what were the, now 30 years later, the absolute, man, I didn't even know I didn't know this, related to learning, related to the topic. What are those and you can weave in some other things too if you want to, but I want to specifically kind of hone in on the learning piece, right? Because somebody might be watching that's just getting started and wants to think about that learning piece. What did that look like for Kevin?
Well, I think that I, um, when you leave working for a big organization, and when you go to work, you have a bunch of other people around you, right? And a lot of my work was doing training or whatever, and but you're not doing that every single day, right? So the days you're not, you're around a bunch of other people. And so when I started my company, on those days I was around nobody. Right? I was around nobody. And so I think that it took me a long time to really figure out that I needed to recreate some new learning pathways, even if they weren't they never were and still aren't. Even though I have a team of people, they're largely not here. No one's here today. One person will be here tomorrow. That same person will be here Thursday, right? So like, trying to find other learning pathways, I think was important. I didn't know that I didn't know that. And I'm not sure I've ever really done as well at building the daily networks. Like I've got a pretty good network of folks that I can reach out to, and I do reach out to. And it's like when I visit with you, it's like time melts, and it's like hasn't been, has been a very short period of time. And yet for us, we've had times where it's been a year between times that we chat, which is silly and ridiculous, but true. And so I haven't always done as good a job maintaining those on the daily, sort of weekly basis that I probably should have, probably to my detriment. But I think the biggest thing is I didn't really I intellectually knew it was going to change. I didn't know how much different it would be. And I think that we have to figure out how to, and that's true really for a lot of people now who are working virtually, right? Mm-hmm. Is finding those connections, those chances to learn together, the learning that comes from spontaneity and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, there is some serendipity to that, right?
Yep,
that
100%.
Things just happen. And so and I believe in creating some serendipity. How would you tell people to do that now? To really, particularly in the times that we're in, right?
How about I haven't read this book yet. There you go. How about that? Harnessing Serendipity. Collaboration artists, conveners, connectors on. I haven't read it, but it's sitting down here on the list. Anyway, so sorry. I'm like, I had to pull it up here. So I need you to ask me the question again. I'm sorry.
Well, I said, maybe we ought to be serendipitous and read that book together. There's a thought. But how do you create that serendipity of having those chance meetings, those things that, and I know that's a little bit paradoxical. I said chance meeting, but you create them, right? But we do create those environments, right?
I think that you can't know what it's going to be, but you have to try to create the chances for it to be. So that means, so as an example, I believe every single episode of my podcast, 407th one I did this morning, there might be a couple at the very beginning this wasn't true for, but I believe nearly every one I've asked the question, so what are you reading? And I asked that question because I asked that question of people, and I have for years. Like when I was in high school, I'd ask people, like, what are you reading? And it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to read it, but sometimes you're like, oh, really? Tell me more about that. And so I continue to do that on the podcast because I think that's of great value to others as well, because it's interesting from a podcast perspective, but maybe that's the thing that people get the most value from. So I think that we need to value those chances when we're with others so that we can create those chances for serendipity. we can't script it, then it wouldn't be serendipitous, right? But what we can do is we can create an environment that's rich for that to happen. And what we can do if we're leading a team that is hybrid in nature is make sure that when people are all together, or in our case, when our whole team is together in another month, that we're taking advantage of that time and physical proximity, because we can't replicate it elsewhere.
Awesome. So to maybe go a little more technical, I guess I'm going to call it that. How do you build your, I'm going to say build your day around being a lifelong learner? Do you have times of days where you do things? I'd love for you to go into that just a little bit. What's the day in a life of Kevin Eikenberry look like?
Well, that I don't know if that's a good, useful conversation, but to answer the first part of the question, which is, do I have routines and do I have times? Absolutely. Now, for me, I'm a morning person, and so I'm up earlier than most people that I know, and it's generally in that time that I'm using that for reflection. I'm using that for writing, a lot of which that writing eventually shows up for someone else to read. But you could say, well, Kevin, you're just producing your work, but that's also part of my journey as a lifelong learner. For me, that isn't necessarily for someone else. But I think that the two pieces that would be broadly applicable would be time for reflection and time for, I'll say, intake, right? For me, it's often reading, not always reading, but time for reflection and time for intake. And so I think we need to build those two times into our days, one way or another. And, if you listen to one podcast a day, you're going to be ahead of most everybody else. If you read for 10 minutes a day, if you read 10 minutes of nonfiction a day, you're going to be ahead of like 97% of Americans, right? And if you read on one topic for 10 or 15 minutes a day, in 3 years, you'll be a world expert in that topic. So, I mean, it doesn't have to take a long time. I'm using those only as markers, not to say, oh, your goal should be to become a world expert in something. That isn't necessarily my point, but rather to say that it's in the routine that matters, and finding it. For me, that's generally morning. I often read in the evening as well, but not always. It just depends. If I'm working on a book, which I'm doing now, I might have time during a day that I'm reading or consuming things that are related to what I'm trying to do to piece together my knowledge and insights for writing, all those sorts of things. But we've got to put it in our day. And I know at different stages of life, people have different amounts of time. Like when I worked for Chevron back before I turned in my badge, much of that time I rode for some of those years, I rode a train to work, and I had like 50 minutes each way. I read a ton, like at least one of those directions. I read the whole time. Well, make a lot of progress reading an hour a day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how often do things come up where, I know in my world there are things that come around where somebody asks me to do something and it's something that's really not been in my wheelhouse, and sometimes that's really exciting to do. How do you, and sometimes we have to be able to decide, is that something that I need to learn? And so there's that question, right? Because we can't have mission creep, whatever you want to call that, right, to our purpose and what have you. But talk about making that decision and taking those kinds of things on as learning, because some of the greatest, I think about some of the greatest learning I've done since things.
Oh, we lost you again. Some of the greatest learning you've done since
the pandemic has been things that I had to learn just to be able to make that pivot, right? And so talk a little about the new things that come up that maybe a client wants or that you're needing to do that you're having to learn, and talk about that process.
Well, I think if we get to the point, and I'm just speaking for Kevin now, right? That if I get to the point where there's never something that I'm being asked to do that doesn't stretch me a little bit, then I'm probably going to get really bored. Now, I will say that early in my career, well, let's be honest, at the beginning of my career, at some point, if you had a check, I was probably going to say yes. I mean, if there's some chance that I'm just being honest, and that isn't necessarily the right answer, but it's what I did. And I struggled with this for many years, especially before I started having a team. But even then, when it's just a couple people, like, we're sort of going to go do this thing because, yeah, we could do that, right? And I think that over time, what I've learned is I could and should aren't the same thing, right? Interesting and wise, not always the same thing. But I also know enough about myself, based back to curiosity, that sometimes I wanted that variety, and I was willing to do that, even though I know from a pure business perspective that might not have been the best thing. There's something we're sort of, I wouldn't say pursuing, but is open to us right now that isn't necessarily what people would say that we would normally do. But in this case, it's with an existing client, right? So if we can add more value for them by doing this thing that we might not go try to sell to anybody else, that might still be wise for us, but we've got to look at it through that lens, I think. And I think the other thing that I've learned over time is that because I took the time to get better in this area, 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 there are new connections now, and it makes us better at the things that we do focus on now, and it makes it harder to compare us to somebody else. And so in some ways, some of those past decisions have become competitive advantage now.
Awesome. And so really it becomes thinking about what your capacity is, and that's going to be for the person to really decide as to how multidisciplinary you can
Yep.
become in those pieces, right? And so not everybody's going to be Kevin, and
Thank
that's
goodness.
okay. And that's okay, and need to recognize that works for some, and others need to stay maybe a little.
I will say this, and you got lost, you got locked up again. But I will say this: I love that term multidisciplinary, and here's why: because that I think that for anyone, especially earlier in your career, that being a specialist, if you make specialist too small of a circle, that's probably not wise. And while we can continue to be a learner inside of that specialty, for most of us, opening that aperture a little bit, opening that lens a little bit, and being a little bit more multidisciplinary is probably going to serve us in lots of positive ways, and would be my encouragement to you. That doesn't mean you have to go to shotgun, right? But I do think that, and scattershot, but I do think that thinking about that in the world that is more complicated than ever, is to our advantage. And I think it plays into the idea, back as we start to wrap up, into this idea of being a lifelong learner.
Just to connect off of that, this broadening, because that really has become kind of a trend, right? We went through the ages of really specializing, and now we've widened out, some from that. And I think the other trend, and I want you to relate this to lifelong learning, because I think lifelong learning is important to this. We also have gone from this expert type person to more of a trusted advisor, or that trusted relationship, right? How does lifelong learning play into that piece?
Well, it's a bit of a paradox given the nature of this particular conversation, but if we lean into being a lifelong learner to become the expert, that's a choice that we can make. But the choice to say, I'm going to be a trusted advisor, that I want to work to really come alongside others, whether that's me as a leader and a coach, or whether it's me in a consulting organization, whatever it is. That second choice is far more complicated. That second choice is far more diverse, multidisciplinary, and carries with it less certainty. Like if I decide that my aim is to be a true expert in something, then I can become that. But that's not the same as being trusted by others to be a thought leader, and for people to really value who I am as well as what I bring, which requires a bunch more skills of me than just knowing the stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think, well, I'll only speak for me, that there's much more satisfaction and significance in the latter than in the former. Like just saying, I'm going to become highly specialized, I'm going to become a true expert in this one little thing. While we can have great impact potentially there, that I think the chance for us to have significance requires us to build a broader set of human skills rather than just a specific set of technical expertise.
Okay. Now, you said we were wrapping up. Do I have time for one more two-part question?
You still have the mic, so I guess so.
Okay, so I do. What I really want to know, and so
we're finally going to get to what you really want to know. 46
I really wanted
in?
to know all this stuff, right? And this is, this is exciting because I learn from you every time you open your mouth. So I appreciate being here to hear this and have the conversation. But for those watching, did that? It looks like I glitched. Did I glitch?
We lost you again. Every time you're about to say something really important or ask me a question, I to try and figure it out. Then, so you
that
said,
was
for those of you who are watching.
Well, it's funny because I think it's just drop the mic, and it truly is dropping the mic when I have those drop the mic. But Kevin is an antique tractor collector, and I had the opportunity to be the grand marshal of the local parade here in Lebanon, and Kevin pulled me in the parade on a one of his antique tractors that's decorated for and painted for our beloved Purdue. It's his Purdue tractor. So enough of that. But Kevin,
that was a fun day, by the way.
It was a fun day and a great day, and I one of those that I will never forget. Even wrote about it because you have a cup holder. You mounted a cup holder on your tractor, which was another learning thing, right? Glitched. Okay, there we go. I glitched. I'm getting onto it now. I can even dodge the. But what I want to know is, in your personal life related to antique tractors, what's the next thing? And then I have a follow up to this. But my first question is, what's the next thing you really want to learn about antique tractors? Something related to your personal love in that. I stumped him.
Well, I'm trying to think about how to share it in a way that's useful to anybody else, right? Like, so I'll answer the question. I'll answer a question related to that, but not the exact question, because I think it'll be more useful. And that is that people sometimes say, you collect antique tractors, or you don't look like that kind of person, whatever that person is supposed to look like, or whatever. But I think that hobby has had a positive impact on the rest of my work and career in ways I never would have thought. in terms of learning more about the history of businesses and the way strategy worked, and learning more about observing people at places like auctions, and several other things. And I guess the point that I would make there is that even though I didn't do it so that I would learn something for business, I've learned valuable lessons and skills from that have come out of that hobby that have impacted and been positively beneficial to our business as well.
Awesome. No, I love that.
Not really your answer to, it's not really your question, but it's an answer to a question about lifelong learning and tractors. So
yeah, it is. And I apologize to the audience if that's not your context. I know that's harder, right? Like in my case, we raise dairy cows. I'm out doing things with that, right? So I get where you're coming from.
Right.
And then
by the way, the next one of these 30-year live streams is going to be on Wednesday night at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And I'm going to have my co-host is Darren Gray. And the topic that he chose is what we can learn about influence from tractors. So we're actually going to talk about the connection of my background and influence. So
cool.
That'll be interesting.
Very cool. So now let's relate to what's the next big thing that you are excited about learning? Because I know you've got something out there. What's that next big thing for you?
Well, I mentioned a book. So I've got a book that I am working on the manuscript for that is due next April. I don't have the title for you all yet, but I believe that it will be a book that will define my career. No pressure, Kevin. And so a lot of my current learning, thinking, reflecting is related to what will be in that book. So that's a big focus for me right now.
Awesome. Man, this has been insightful. Very insightful. And so do I still have time, or what are we?
You got like 5 minutes.
I've got like 5 minutes, right? Okay. So,
by the way, everybody, I knew this was not going to be short with Byron. Just saying. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I went to the beginning of your career, and now I want to go to 30 years in. And I know people who, and I'm going to send them, once you've got this out for a link, I'm going to send them this link. I know people who are in their 30th years of career who are really struggling to really find that passion, that purpose, right? We talked about it earlier. Help us. I just want to drive it home now started at the beginning, we'll go to the end. What's your advice? What can they do to get them out of that? And what's your coaching advice here?
Yeah. So first of all, I know that I am exceedingly blessed that I am doing the work that I was put on the earth to do. So my answer wouldn't necessarily be your answer as I'm talking to all of you. But I have an answer for you. And here's what I think it is. And that is that, if you're in the downhill of your career, let's just say of your career or of your job, then my advice would be, what can you do in the next 2-3 years or whatever time you've got left is to really close strong? What can you do to leave your company, organization, team in a better place than it was before? Think about the legacy that you want to leave, the impact that you want to have. Because I think if you frame it around that, then you have a chance to say, I can get excited about how do I want to leave a legacy, as opposed to I'm just going to sort of fade into the sunset. And I think that probably comes back to, how do I nurture relationships? How do I mentor? How do I encourage others? Those kinds of things. And there's probably plenty of learning for us there to get better at doing those things. But notice, Byron, it comes back to what we've been saying all along, which was when we have purpose, our willingness, desire, interest in learning is heightened. And so whether it's Keith saying, I want to continue to learn in retirement, and I am retired and I'm not going to work anymore, but maybe maybe it's a hobby, or it's something else that you're going to do. Maybe it's getting involved in your community in a new sort of way. Maybe it could be anything, right? But find that thing that, maybe you're going to learn how to play the ukulele. I don't know, the harmonica. I have no idea. The bagpipes. I've got nothing. But what I do know is that once we make that decision, and even if our purpose in that is to have some fun with it, then I think that will help us a great deal.
I love that you've closed this out with find that thing, right? It is about that purpose for that. And so I think that's all about lifelong learning. Gosh, Kevin, my friend, this has been incredible.
Well, Byron, thank you for doing this and investing your hour and some prep time to do it. I personally appreciate it, and I know anyone who's listening or watching appreciates it as well. And if you were watching this and found it useful, do what Byron's going to do and share it with others. We would be honored if you would do that, and that would serve my purpose in doing that, which is to perhaps provide some insight and some inspiration and maybe some practical ideas to help you on your lifelong learning journey. So Byron, thank you. And as I said to all of you, I'll be back here on Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern time, and whatever platform you're on, you'll find me here again. So look for that link and join us then. I hope you'll do that. And Byron, let's not be so long before we get together again, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.